Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling a pretty big topic, the fight for equality for Hispanic Americans.
Yeah, it's a story that's often overlooked, but it's absolutely essential to understanding American history, and the challenges that continue to this day.
Absolutely. And we've got a great source to guide us, Mr. Hutchings History. It takes a really comprehensive look at this fight, starting all the way back in the 19th century and bringing us right up to the 21st.
What's really fascinating about this source is that it doesn't shy away from the complexity of the issue.
Exactly. It acknowledges that there isn't one single Latino experience, right? Each group, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, and so many others, they've all faced their own unique sets of challenges and triumphs.
And that's something we really want to unpack today. Explore those different experiences, those turning points, and try to understand where things stand now in terms of equality.
And just to give you a sense of how relevant this is, did you know that Latinos are projected to be the majority in California by 2040?
Wow, that's a huge demographic shift. It really highlights how this isn't just history, it's a story that's still unfolding, and it's impacting all of us.
So let's dive in. Our source starts by setting the stage in the mid-1800s, a time of major Mexican-American immigration, especially after the U.S.-Mexico War.
Right, and what we see right away is the emergence of these really troubling patterns of discrimination. I mean, we're talking about everything from racially motivated violence to laws that explicitly limited their rights.
It's almost like that period set the stage for the struggles that would follow.
Yeah.
But even amidst this adversity, you start to see the seeds of activism being planted. Groups like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, emerge as these early champions for Mexican-American civil rights. What did you think about that part?
Oh, I found that really inspiring. It shows that even in the face of such injustice, there was this determination to fight back, to organize and advocate for change. And it really laid the groundwork for the larger movements that would gain momentum in the decades to come.
Definitely. And I think the 1960s is a great example of that momentum building. It's a decade where the fight for equality really explodes onto the national stage, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's a pivotal moment in the story.
One of the key turning points is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally addressed those discriminatory voting practices that had kept so many Hispanic Americans from having their voices heard. I mean, can you imagine how impactful that was?
Huge. Absolutely huge. It was a major victory, not just for Hispanic Americans, but for the entire civil rights movement. It was a step towards dismantling those barriers that had kept so many disenfranchised for so long.
And alongside these legal victories, you have figures like Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, the UFW, really capturing the nation's attention. They were organizing these massive boycotts, bringing the plight of migrant farm workers to the forefront.
Chavez was a master strategist. He understood the power of a nonviolent protest, taking inspiration from the civil rights movement happening in the South.
It's incredible how they mobilized communities and brought about real change. What do you think was the secret sauce? How did they do it?
Well, I think it was their ability to connect with people on a human level. They weren't just fighting for abstract rights. They were sharing their personal stories, their struggles, their hopes for a better future. And that resonated with people no matter who they were.
And it wasn't just about labor rights either. The Chicano movement was also gaining traction during this time, pushing for wider recognition of their cultural identity and demanding better schools and housing.
Right. And this is where we start to see the complexity of this fight for equality. It wasn't just one single movement, It was a tapestry of different experiences. It's like each group was adding their unique voice and perspective to the struggle.
And that diversity of experiences is so important to understanding the bigger picture. Our source points out that Puerto Ricans, even though they've been U.S. citizens since 1917, face their own set of deep-seated prejudices.
Absolutely. Citizenship, unfortunately, didn't equal equality.
So true. And they had to fight for their rights, too, especially those who migrated to the mainland after the 1950s.
You see this surge in Puerto Rican activism, especially in places like New York City, They were pushing for economic justice, better schools, and an end to the discrimination they faced every day.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality has taken many different forms and has been waged on many different fronts. Now, in contrast to the struggles of Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, the Cuban-American experience is often portrayed as this model minority success story, right?
Right, but our source is quick to point out that's not that simple, especially after the 1980 Mariel Boatlift.
Yeah, that event really challenged the perception of Cuban Americans as this monolithic group. It brought in a wave of refugees who were often poorer and darker skinned than previous waves of immigrants.
And it really exposed the existing racial tensions within the U.S. It showed that even within the Latino community, there were these divisions based on skin color and class.
It's a good reminder that we can't oversimplify these narratives, right? Each group has its own complex story, and understanding those nuances is crucial if we really want to grasp the full picture. And that brings us to a really critical part of this deep dive, which is the economic realities faced by Hispanic Americans. By the 21st century, there's no denying their vital role in the U.S. economy.
Totally. Their labor is the backbone of so many industries, from agriculture to construction to the service sector.
Exactly. They're a huge part of what makes the nation's economy tick. But here's where things get tricky. Despite this vital role, the data reveals these really persistent economic inequalities.
Like, for example, in 1999, the average Latino household income was significantly lower than the national average.
It's a stark reminder that you can be a contributing member of society, vital to the economy, and still face these systemic disadvantages. And education plays a huge role in this, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A much smaller percentage of Hispanic Americans had college degrees in the year 2000 compared to white Americans. And that educational gap feeds directly into the income gap, creating this cycle of inequality that's incredibly difficult to break.
It's like this perfect storm of factors that make it so much harder for so many to get ahead. And that's where the fight for equality continues, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a reminder that legal victories are essential, but they don't magically erase the deep-seated inequalities that have been baked into the system for generations.
And that brings us to another really crucial part of this story, which is the fight for equal access to education. We'll dive into that after a quick break, so stay with us. Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about those economic disparities, and I think it's a perfect segue into the discussion about education because it's such a key factor in achieving equality, right?
Absolutely. Education is the foundation for so much, for economic opportunity, for social mobility, for really breaking those cycles of poverty and discrimination.
And our source highlights this really interesting point, which is that even after landmark legal victories like Brown v. Board of Education, which officially ended segregation in schools.
A lot of Hispanic students continued to face segregation, but in a more subtle way.
It's like segregation without the explicit laws, right?
Yeah.
What they call de facto segregation.
Right, exactly. It's like even though segregation was outlawed, those patterns of inequality continued to exist, often because of things like housing patterns or school funding disparities.
And that brings us to the Lau v. Nichols case, which was a pivotal moment for bilingual education in the U.S. Can you remind us what that case was about?
Sure. So in 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that schools had to provide support for students whose primary language wasn't English.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, how can you expect kids to learn if they can't even understand what's being said in the classroom?
Exactly. It was a major victory for so many Hispanic students who were basically being left behind simply because they weren't fluent in English. It was about leveling the playing field and giving them a fair chance to succeed.
But even after Lau v. Nichols, our source points out that the fight for bilingual education didn't end. In fact, there was a pretty big backlash against these programs, especially in the 1990s in states like California. Why do you think that happened?
Well, social change often comes with resistance, right? I mean, it's not always a smooth, linear progression. In this case, there were these concerns about whether bilingual education was actually effective.
So some people felt it was actually hindering students' ability to learn English.
Right, and it became a very politically charged issue, with some folks arguing that it was actually promoting separatism rather than integration.
Which is interesting, right? Because the intention was to help students integrate, not the opposite.
Absolutely. But it shows just how complex these issues can be. There are always these different perspectives, different interpretations, and it often comes down to these fundamental debates about what's the best way to achieve equality.
And that brings us to another really complex and often debated issue, affirmative action.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
So for those of us who might not be totally up to speed on this, can you give us like a quick primer on what affirmative action is and why it's so controversial?
Sure. Affirmative action policies were put in place to try and address the historical disadvantages that minorities, including Hispanic Americans, had faced. So the basic idea was to try and create more opportunities for these groups, in areas like education and employment.
So it's like recognizing that the playing field isn't level and trying to tilt it a bit to even things out.
Exactly. But the thing is, it's been criticized for using race or ethnicity as a factor in things like college admissions or hiring decisions.
And the argument against it is that it's reverse discrimination,
Right.
that it's not fair to give someone an advantage just because of their background.
Right, and that it can actually lead to more division and resentment. So you have these two very different perspectives, both with valid points, and it's been a really contentious issue.
And our source does a good job of presenting both sides of that argument without taking a stance, which I think is really important. It lets you grapple with the complexities of the issue without feeling like you're being told what to think.
Definitely. It's about giving people the information they need to form their own opinions. And, you know, there are a lot of different perspectives on this, and it's a debate that's not going away anytime soon.
Not at all. And our source even mentions this example of California's Proposition 209, which was passed back in 1996, and it basically ended affirmative action in state programs. Do you remember what the impact of that was?
Yeah, well, the results were pretty significant. Like, we saw this sharp decline in the number of Hispanic students being admitted to top universities like UC Berkeley. It just shows you how high the stakes are in this whole debate.
It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract ideas, you know. These policies have real-world consequences. They can either help to break down barriers or they can reinforce existing inequalities. But, you know, amidst all these challenges, there's this really inspiring story that emerges from our source: the rise of Latino political power.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge part of this narrative, isn't it? It's like this parallel storyline that runs alongside the fight for equality, you know, demonstrating the growing influence and activism of Hispanic Americans.
And one of the key turning points in that story is the formation of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus back in 1976. They really became a powerful voice in Washington, advocating for the needs and interests of their communities.
Absolutely. It was a major step forward in terms of representation, having a seat at the table where decisions are being made. That's huge.
And it wasn't just at the national level either. Our source talks about how there was this dramatic increase in the number of Latino elected officials at all levels of government, from city councils to state legislatures.
You know, the numbers are pretty striking, like from just 1,400 Latino elected officials in 1973 to over 5,400 in 1994.
That's a huge jump. It shows how the community was becoming more politically aware, more organized, and more determined to have their voices heard.
It was strategic, for sure. I mean, they realized that if they wanted to bring about real change, they needed to have a say in how things were run. They needed to be in positions of power.
And as the Latino population continued to grow, so did their political clout, especially in states with large Hispanic populations, places like California, Texas, Florida. These states play such a key role in national elections.
Totally. And that's why this demographic shift has had such a big impact on American politics. It's no longer a question of whether Latino voters matter, you know. They're a force to be reckoned with.
It's really reshaped the political landscape, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And it brings us to what I find to be one of the most exciting parts of this whole story, this cultural and demographic revolution that's been happening over the past few decades.
Yeah. It's a revolution that's really changed the face of America.
It's like the country is becoming more diverse, more vibrant, and the numbers really reflect that. Like between 1974 and 2000, the number of Spanish-language radio stations in the U.S. increased by a whopping 190%.
Wow, that's a huge increase. It just shows you the growing influence of Latino culture, you know.
It's a sign of the times, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just radio, it's television, it's music, it's food, it's everything. Latino culture has become mainstream American culture. And remember that stat we mentioned earlier. Latinos are projected to be the majority in California by 2040.
It's a major demographic shift, and it's bound to have a huge impact on all aspects of American society.
But of course, as with any major change, there's also been some pushback, some anxieties about what this demographic shift means for the future of the country.
Right, and our source talks about how some commentators, particularly on the conservative side, have expressed these fears of what they call a balkanized America.
So when they say balkanization, they're basically talking about the potential for the country to become fragmented, divided along ethnic and cultural lines, right?
Exactly. They worry that this growing diversity will somehow weaken national unity.
Which I can understand. To some extent, right? Change can be scary. It's natural to have some anxieties about what it might mean for the future. But it's interesting because on the other side of the spectrum, you have liberal historians and scholars who embrace this growing multiculturalism, who see it as a source of strength and enrichment for American society.
Totally. They argue that diversity brings new ideas, new perspectives, new experiences, all of which ultimately make the nation stronger and more vibrant.
It's like two very different visions of what America could be, right? And it raises some really fundamental questions about, like, what does it mean to be American in a rapidly changing world?
Exactly. Like, how do we embrace our diversity while still maintaining a sense of unity? How do we create a society that's inclusive and welcoming to everyone, regardless of their background?
These are big questions, and they're questions that we'll continue to wrestle with as a nation. But one thing's for sure, the growing Latino population is a reality, and it's having a profound impact on the country in so many ways. It's like we're at this really interesting crossroads, and the choices we make today will determine what kind of future we create for ourselves and for generations to come.
It's a pretty pivotal moment, wouldn't you say? Like, we have the opportunity to create something truly remarkable, a society that's more just, more equitable, and more representative of the incredible diversity of its people. But it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of willingness to confront some of the really tough issues that we've been talking about.
And that's why this deep dive has been so valuable, I think, because it's given us this historical context, it's helped us understand the challenges, and it's inspired us to think critically about what we can do to create a better future. But, we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore, so many different stories to tell, so many different perspectives to consider.
Right. This deep dive is just a starting point.
It's like a jumping off point for further exploration.
Exactly. And we hope it's inspired you to keep learning and to keep engaging with these issues, because the more we understand about the past, the better equipped we'll be to shape the future.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, but I do agree it's exciting to think that we could be part of shaping that future.
It really is. And, like you said, learning from the past is so key.
Oh, for sure. This whole deep dive into the Hispanic American fight for equality has been eye-opening. We've seen how far things have come, but also how much work still needs to be done.
Exactly. I mean, it's a story of progress, but it's not a straight line, There have been setbacks, and there are still these deep-seated inequalities that we have to address.
And what I find so inspiring is this constant thread of resilience, activism, and a belief in the promise of America. Like, generation after generation, Hispanic Americans have kept pushing forward.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, think about all the obstacles they've faced, and yet they've never given up hope.
It's a testament to the power of, the human spirit, that desire for a better future. So before we wrap up, I wanted to just kind of circle back to our source, Mr. Hutchings History, because it really gave us a solid foundation for understanding this complex story.
Absolutely. Mr. Hutchings History does such a great job of presenting this nuanced perspective,
Yeah.
It doesn't sugarcoat anything, but it also doesn't dwell on the negatives.
It's balanced, I think that's the word.
Yeah, balanced. And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is that the fight for equality isn't over. It's something that's happening right now, and it will continue to unfold in the years to come.
Like, it's not a chapter that's closed, right? It's a story that's still being written.
Exactly. And while it's important to acknowledge and celebrate the progress that's been made,
We can't get complacent.
right, we can't rest on our laurels. The fight for a truly just and equitable society, it requires constant effort, constant vigilance.
And that's where our listeners come in, right? We've given them a taste of this incredible story. But it's up to them to continue exploring, to keep learning, to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Like, get involved in your community, advocate for change, use your voice. The future's being written right now, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Likewise. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the Hispanic American fight for equality. We hope you've learned something new, and we hope you're inspired to keep digging deeper. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.